Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Waymakers, the podcast that talks about women who are forging their own way in this world. Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode. By now we'll all have been made aware of the Queen's passing, and we are gearing up to the state funeral. Obviously, this is not something that's happened for 70 years, so it's new. And considering how different the world is between when her father passed and now that King Charles has ascended to the throne, it's fascinating to see the approach that a lot of corporations have taken. Not just in terms of their tributes to the Queen, which obviously are great, and there is definitely a need to be respectful and acknowledge the impact that she's had on British culture, on the world, definitely the world, and also how people are reacting to what should be done on the actual day of the funeral. So in the UK, there's a bank holiday on Monday, the 19th, which... Sorry. The one thing, I keep laughing because, first of all, it's not funny, but some of the scrambling has actually been quite comical. And when I say scrambling, I'm thinking of Centre Parks. Just the utter chaos that must have been happening in that office when someone decided that they were going to close the park just for that day, which would mean that anyone who had a booking that happened to go across that day would have to leave the park. They could leave their belongings in their lodge or their room, but they would have to physically leave, and they would not be able to come back until, I believe, later that day or the next day, which makes no sense whatsoever. Absolutely no sense. I can understand wanting to give the opportunity to your workers to be able to, mourn and watch the ceremony. And I'm sure people could be respectful of the fact that you would have to shut down operations or close down facilities for a few hours while people were able to do that. But I just think, and they've obviously had to make a real quick U-turn in that decision, because obviously it was ridiculous and really poorly thought out and poorly planned. And it makes me laugh because this happens a lot, especially when you have businesses who want to be seen to be doing the right thing, and in their haste to do so, make ridiculous decisions like this. Now, I'm not saying that, it's not right for people to close stores, etc., but this is impractical. And I just think you're going to pee people off rather than make them think, oh, what a great organisation. It's good that they're doing that. I'm like, no. And now we've got, quite a long list. A lot of supermarkets are not going to be open that day, so better get your shopping for Monday beforehand. So following on from last week's episode where I talked about imposter syndrome briefly, I got some feedback about my comment as to whether or not men experience or suffer from imposter syndrome. And actually, I did hear from someone and their experience of it, and actually I definitely admit that I was hasty in saying that wasn't possible or something that men didn't experience, because clearly they did. And unfortunately, imposter syndrome is something that affects everyone potentially. I saw this really interesting video from the School of Life, which I love. It's like they've got a collection of books and they do talks and things like that. And they said this phrase I thought was really interesting, and it was about imposter syndrome, where they talked about we see others from the outside, whereas we see ourselves from the inside, which contributes a lot to feelings of imposter syndrome, because you don't actually see the flaws that we are so aware of in ourselves in other people. And that really struck a chord with me. And something else that struck a chord with me actually was listening to an older episode of Private Parts with Jamie Lang and Alex Mitten. I used to be a massive fan of Red and Chelsea, but I actually really enjoy listening to that podcast occasionally, so definitely check it out. And they were talking to other podcasters from Shits and Gigs, I think it's called, or Shits and Giggles, I'm not sure. And they actually talked about imposter syndrome and their feelings of it, because seemingly they had what could be described as overnight success, but there was a lot of grind and work that went into it. But also they were in a new space. Podcasting is still kind of growing. We don't really know where it goes, and people like me are giving it a try every week, and it can seem strange to them because they have no one really to compare themselves to, so they do feel, or they express feelings of feeling fraudulent and having to stop and think and be like, well, no, I've been working really hard at this and I've been doing this, and therefore there should be no feelings of imposter syndrome, or there's no basis in feeling that way. But I thought that was interesting that people who seemingly come across so confident can also feel the same. So I think if it's a lesson to any of us, it's that we all have those feelings of inadequacy at some point or another. And sometimes you do have to silence that little voice in the corner of your mind that tells you don't deserve to be there, and it's not true. So, moving on to a slightly lighter topic. I love binge watching TV. Big fan of TV in general. But I started watching this show, I haven't finished yet, so please no spoilers, called Partner Track on Netflix. And I don't know how to explain it. It's such a random, almost cheesy drama, but not super intense, but has some really intense moments, where it's based on a woman who is, as the title says, on the partner track, and she's of East Asian descent, and she is just navigating her way through the old boys club, trying to figure out her place in that world and how she can work through it, where she seems to have to work not even twice as hard, like 3, 4, 5 times as hard as her white male counterparts, but doesn't seem to get the same opportunities as the individuals who are connected. And I just thought it was really interesting, that approach, and the fact that they actually tackle quite deeply the idea of being used as a token in one part of, as a subplot, and how you approach that, and just how you approach that with other co-workers who are also in a similar boat as you, where she was used as the token to then be the mouthpiece to the other non-white co-worker. And I would definitely recommend giving it a watch, because it's quite fun, quite lighthearted, a bit steamy. Wasn't expecting it to be as raunchy as some of it is. But yeah, she definitely represents some of us, I think, or you can definitely connect to some of the feelings you can have at work when you're surrounded in that situation. You kind of are alone in it, and you hold on to other people who might understand how you feel, but then she's put in a position where she's kind of made to use her commonality with someone else as a way to be the bearer of bad news, and that couldn't have been easy for her. But yeah, that's my Netflix recommendation for the moment. So, on to the next segment, which is the dilemma segment. So, I've actually found a thread on Reddit that I came across and I thought it was really interesting. I love the AITA threads on Reddit that sometimes come up on Twitter. And it's fascinating to see how many people lack just self-awareness, or just some people just have ridiculous people in their lives. But this one was quite interesting because I think this woman had really great tips actually in what she'd said, and I thought it was a really interesting approach. So I'm just going to jump right in. Am I the arsehole for giving the wrong type, in quotation marks, of career tips to my niece? My cousin Becky and her husband Jeff have a daughter Mia who's in college for computer science. At a recent family get-together, Jeff and Becky were encouraging me to give her advice for her career and for job hunting since I'm a software engineer. And they felt like she was too focused on her sorority this year. So I gave her a few tips alongside a few categories. I'll write a quick summary of what I said. Getting a job. Getting interviews is more about networking than technical skills. Connections let you skip the line. My college sports and activities helped me far more in my career than anything, and her sorority, which is for women in STEM, would really help her down the line. She should reach out to alumni too. Interviews are also often about, can I see myself working with this person? So if you can make a social connection at an interview, you're usually in. Look up your interview's hobbies, interests, etc. Navigating work and workplace boundaries. Until you really trust someone, only talk on workplace channels. Harassment happens, and having that on work devices will force HR to handle it. Never give a superior a personal phone number. With the power dynamic, it isn't appropriate for them to have that. Only list a separate work line on your resumes and no home address. Google Voice is good for this. Reference check companies back. If you're interviewing with a company, find 3 present or past employees who will talk and ask the real questions about how they're treated so you don't end up at an abusive or sexist workplace. Give 50 to 70% effort at the start. No nights or weekends. Whatever you do at the start sets a baseline expectation. With a lower one, it's sustainable, and if you temporarily raise your effort level, people will be very impressed. But if you start high and scale back, you'll be seen negatively. Cover your ass. If anyone promises you something or tells you something verbally, send a follow-up email summarising the conversation and inviting them to correct you if there has been a misunderstanding. Usually you don't get corrections, so you can first set the narrative in writing, which is very useful if people say, I never said that, later on. Growing your career. Be nice to everyone. So many new graduates want to be the know-it-all to prove themselves, and they F themselves over. Be supportive and collaborative instead, and people will be there for you in return. Always talk salary with your peers. Keep a LinkedIn up to date. Just as your employer will have a yearly review of you as an employee, have a yearly review of them as an employer. If they aren't meeting your expectations, move on. The job hopping stigma isn't a thing at respectable tech companies. To be honest, I thought that was a really minimal list. I elaborated a lot more, but those are the main things I learned from experience. And for every one of them, I learned through making mistakes. So I felt like I was giving good advice. Mia was definitely interested in what I was saying and asked a lot of questions about the experiences I'd had which taught me this stuff. But after I talked with her, a few days had passed and I got a really angry text from Jeff saying that he had heard my advice to Mia was to focus more on making social connections than on her studies, to play games at work, like acting like you can reference check a company and use fake numbers and do shit that would make everyone know you have one foot out the door. I replied to say that wasn't exactly what I said, and I clarified by writing out what I'd said in a similar way to this post. And he said that I was just doubling down on what I said, that it is awful advice and he'd wanted someone to tell his daughter to focus on her studies. I said, to be honest, if I could go back in time and tell my college self anything, it would be to have less of a focus on my studies and more of a focus on networking, soft skills, and street smarts to look out for myself in a male-dominated career. Most engineers are technically competent. One who's socially competent too is a rarer find, and that will serve her well, in my opinion. He got really upset with me and said that I was entitled and out of touch and giving horrible advice. Am I the arsehole for the advice I gave? In short, no, I don't believe she's the arsehole. I actually think this is really, really great advice. And I think not just in the tech world, but I think can be applied in like a lot of corporate environments. The giving 50 to 70% at the start of a job is something that I've definitely thought to myself and tried to do, which sounds really strange because you usually think you kind of have to hit the ground running, but you do need to have a bit of leeway so that you can then impress people later on. And as she referred to it, it's your baseline and it sets the expectation. But all in all, I think this is really good advice. And she's obviously speaking from experience. She understands that in her industry, there's a certain way to behave. And I've heard this from a few different people in terms, especially in tech and engineering, etc., where people can be competent technically, but it's the soft skills that are lacking. And it's actually those are the ones that help you grow in your career and move up in your career. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I mainly read that out because I actually thought that was really good advice. But I think it's interesting how like different this is seen. So I think obviously her brother didn't appreciate the advice. I mean, I feel like her niece maybe needs to work on her listening and comprehension, because if the way she's passed it on to her dad is how she heard it, then that's obviously problematic. But also, don't know if this is really how it was put down to her by the original poster. But I think I even mentioned it in the episode about interview prep, where I said interviews are often about the interviewer thinking or deciding if the interviewee is someone that they can actually see themselves working with. So it is true. There is, there should be more of an emphasis on the social connections you make and the social aspect of a job. Obviously, that's not the be all and end all. You should still be able to do that job and have the requisite skills. But that's, unfortunately, for some, can be a bit difficult, the social side of things. So if you need to, then work on that. Reference check companies. I mean, I'm assuming that the person who's posted this is American, especially because they refer to sororities. But, I think that that's a good thing to do. And there's great websites that are out here, like Glassdoor, for example, which can give you an insight into what an entity's like. People can be quite open and honest on those sites about their experiences of previous companies or companies that they're currently working for. And I think it would be helpful to get an idea of what the culture is like, what the environment's like, and if there's even room for growth and what the view of management is. So at least you can be armed with information. I would say take it with a pinch of salt. Let's face it, it's a review site like TripAdvisor, for example, and unfortunately the way that we are set up as humans, we're only likely to put a review up or say something if we've had a negative experience, but you do often see positive responses to those things. So don't take them as gospel, but take it under advisement. If it sounds really problematic, then maybe that's something that you can either flag in the interview if it feels that bad, or bear that in mind when making a decision if that's a job offer you want to accept. Covering your ass, that was actually something that is really important. Definitely make sure that you can CC people in emails to make sure that other people are aware of. But yeah, if you have a conversation and you're not sure, or someone's asked you to produce some work or giving you instructions verbally, then for sure follow up with an email just to be really clear. Also for yourself, to make sure that, they may have forgotten something and you don't want them to turn around and be like, why haven't you done this aspect of it, when it's not something they even mentioned to you or emphasise was important. So you want to make it really, really clear for your own benefit. I wouldn't just call it covering your ass, but it's also making sure that you do a good job. So yeah, definitely if you've received verbal instructions, try and follow up with a written email to clarify or confirm what was expected of you. And job hopping, I think it depends on your industry, and clearly she was quite specific about at tech companies job hopping. There isn't a stigma, and I think overall that there's not really a huge stigma in the sense of what our previous generations were used to having, a job for life. We don't have that, and actually, the best way to get a salary increase is by getting a new job. Unfortunately, companies don't see I say that's a very generalistic term, but some companies don't see the upside in providing market rate salaries to everyone and base their salaries on their current baseline. And unfortunately, these things don't always get addressed unless someone new has been brought in and it's quite clear that they've got a bigger pay rise or bigger pay jump compared to their peers. But I think it's unfortunate that this was considered a really bad advice, because actually I think it's really great advice, especially for a woman that's going into this kind of industry, to receive that advice from another woman. Unfortunately, your experience will be different to that of a man's. And I think it's actually really arrogant of her brother to assume that this was all wrong, because it's very different from what they expect, and to focus on their studies. You're going to leave with a degree, it's going to be no different from any of your other peers. What's going to set you apart from someone else? I think that's really important to work on those skills as well, just as, I wouldn't say more so, but just as important than the actual technical skills, depending on the kind of career you've got. So on that note, I bid you adieu. And as always, if you would like a free consultation for a business coaching session, please feel free to email me and send across any dilemmas to guy3@nbg-coaching.com.